Even before the attack on the World Trade Center in New York, intelligence agencies were watching a number of suspected terrorist cells throughout the United States. The FBI uncovered evidence of a terrible crime by some individuals using the cover of a St. Louis grocery store. But it took a forensic autopsy and a tape to reveal the entire story. 16-year-old Tina Issa was the kind of daughter most parents dream of. She was a high school athlete, popular, a straight-A student, and wanted to attend college and become an airline pilot.
Tina wanted to be American. Tina wanted to be independent. She wanted to have a career. She wanted to travel. She wanted to be her own person.
Her mother and father, Zane and Maria Issa, were immigrants from Palestine and ran a small grocery store in downtown St. Louis.
Like most immigrants, the Palestinians went into the food business. That's a tradition in America. Food service is one of the easiest types of business to operate. What was especially appealing to the Issas and their exes, they would play little games with food stamp fraud, grocery coupons. I mean, Zane even said he loved America because there were so many ways to rip it off.
On November 6, 1989, Tina was working the night shift at a fast food restaurant. According to the Issas, Tina arrived home around midnight and there was an argument. Tina said she wanted to live on her own and demanded that her parents give her $5,000 to support herself. When they refused, they said Tina pulled a knife from her backpack and threatened them. In the tussle, Zane said he turned the knife on his daughter in self-defense.
Father was saying it was self-defense, and the wife was saying, yes, it was self-defense. I was standing there watching it. So the only two witnesses to the crime had their stories kind of get together that their daughter had attacked them, and in defending themselves, the father had killed her.
News of Tina Issa's death stunned her friends and classmates.
Just her charisma, just her attitude overall, period. I mean, she was just too nice of a person for anything like this to happen to.
Why would he want to start his own child? It's terrible. I feel so bad.
Tina's classmates told police that Tina often rebelled against her parents and their old world traditions. They also said the Issas objected to Tina's choice of a boyfriend.
He was an honor student. He was very, very bright. He was at the magnet schools, which is a sophisticated program in St. Louis public schools. He was an artist. He painted, he drew, he wrote poems. I don't think it was just that he was black. I think the real issue was that she had a boyfriend and they could no longer control her.
When the FBI heard about Tina's death, they called lead investigator Harry Hager with some astonishing news. U.S. intelligence had photographed Zane Issa attending a meeting with known terrorists in Mexico. All had ties to the Palestine Liberation Organization and international terror broker Abu Nidal.
Abu Nidal means father of war. Abu, father, Nidal, war. And he was one of the most vicious terrorists around. He's responsible for simultaneous bombings in Vienna, Rome.
Over a 2-year period, Zane Issa traveled overseas 14 times to Caracas, Athens, London, Israel, Zurich, and Madrid.
The FBI, among others, were maintaining a watch on Middle Eastern families, some that might presumably have connections with terrorist cells. The Issas were maintaining what might have been a safe house for one of the Middle Eastern terrorist groups.
So the Issa family were well known to U.S. intelligence.
As a federal undercover said to me, these people are as organized as the mafia, not nearly as lovable.
Investigators now wondered whether there was more to the story of Tina's death than her mother and father were saying.
The wounds as a whole.
Tina sustained 6 deep stab wounds to the solar plexus, all in close proximity. Dr. Birch believed that any one of them could have caused her death.
The serious injuries to her were all tightly clustered right around her lower central chest and abdomen. And I was told that she was supposedly involved in a wild, free-for-all type fight with a knife. And that seemed to be very odd that all of the fatal injuries were very tightly clustered within a specific area of the body.
That's because stabbing victims usually move during an attack.
I didn't feel that she was involved in a fight where she was able to move her extremities freely. That is, either she stayed stock still of her own volition for whatever reason, or she was unable to move, or she was actually restrained.
Dr. Birch's theory was supported by paramedics who said Tina's arms were above her head on the floor as if she had been restrained.
Zane couldn't have held her. He was not a big man. His daughter was probably as big or bigger than he. He could not have inflicted that kind of injury pattern on her and held her at the same time.
The only other person in the room was Tina's mother, Maria. Maria said she was on the sofa when the fight occurred, but the forensic evidence indicated otherwise.
There was body hair and blood from the girl on the insides of a white sweater that Maria had been wearing at the time, and that supported our theory that Maria was holding her while Zane stabbed her.
It went beyond self-defense. This was like driven by anger or passion or some purpose other than self-defense.
Investigators then took a closer look at the wounds on Zane's hands. Wounds that he said were defensive.
This story didn't match what we saw. It was a small, like I said, it looked like a paper cut.
I think that in stabbing her, his hands were so bloody and slippery that what really happened is his hand slipped down on the blade of the knife and cut it right across the outside of his palm there, right below the little finger.
This explains why Zane's blood was found on the handle of the knife found beside his daughter. But prosecutors had a problem. Would a jury believe that a father and mother would kill their own child simply because she had an outside job and a boyfriend?
Sounds so aberrant, so strange. I mean, she was a model student. But we're talking about absolute control. Zane Issa still mentally was listening to tapes from circa 1945 in a Palestinian village, and that's the way he thought his daughter should behave.
And the FBI discovered secret information that Tina Issa may have known some family secrets her father didn't want revealed. The forensic evidence clearly showed that 16-year-old Tina Issa had not been killed in self-defense, as her parents claimed. Dr. Victor Levine is an expert on the Middle East and says Tina's death sounded tragically familiar.
Zane Issa comes from a small town in Palestine, and he carried with him that whole baggage. Every day, there are dozens and even hundreds of women who are in some fashion killed for the commission of some crime involving the sexual honor of the family.
Although dating is common in the United States, it's discouraged in parts of the Middle East where arranged marriages are the norm.
When a man and his family have daughters, daughters are, the purity of these women, of these daughters, then guarantees a marriage. And the delivery of the girl intact, virginally intact, which then commands a higher dowry. A girl who has been violated does not command a dowry, in fact, may not be able to find a husband.
Tina's death may have been part of an old tradition, the honor killing.
She stained the family's honor, and blood, Zane would say, blood must cleanse blood.
In societies where honor killings are common, it is generally a killing done by a male member of a family, presumably to avenge a depredation on the honor of a female member of the family. she had a black boyfriend. And this was enough to cause the anger of her family and of her father to arise to the boiling point, where indeed he felt that the family had been so shamed by her indiscretion that the only way to avenge it was to kill her.
Prosecutors were convinced she had been murdered in cold blood by her own parents. But they knew a conviction would be difficult. It would be the Isa's story of self-defense against the opinion of the medical examiner. But soon, investigators got an unexpected break. The FBI admitted they had wiretapped the Isa's home because of Zane's suspected ties to known terrorists.
Wiretaps were put in under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, known as FISA. FISA allows the FBI to tap you, wiretaps, that run reel-to-reel, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Isa was not considered important enough to monitor these wiretaps 24 hours a day. So the FBI wasn't sure what was on them, and they would need to be translated since the Isas spoke Arabic. Fortunately, the FBI used the best listening devices available.
They're very simple. They're top of the line. They could pick up a whisper at 50 feet, some of these things, if they're placed properly.
Placement of any listening device is crucial. After breaking into the Isa apartment, agents did not have much time to plant the bug. They needed not only a place to hide the device, but also a power source. A battery-operated device is the easiest to plant. But with a long-term surveillance, the battery would need to be replaced periodically.
Get in there once, you're lucky. You get in there twice, you're even luckier, and the third time you're bound to get caught.
The FBI had been able to connect the devices to electric inside Isa's apartment. And prosecutors learned that the wiretaps clearly picked up the altercation between Tina and her parents. But the FBI was concerned about releasing the tapes for a public trial, fearing they would compromise their electronic surveillance of other suspected terrorists. Ultimately, the Attorney General of the United States at the time, Richard Thornburg, decided to release them.
It was the most chilling, cold-blooded, horrifying thing I'd ever heard, or ever probably will hear.
You don't have to have it translated. You don't have to turn the volume up. In fact, at several times you want to turn the volume down.
But would the tape reveal whether Tina Isa was killed in self-defense or murdered in cold blood? Prosecutors now had something almost unheard of in the history of American justice: an audio recording of the events before, during, and after Tina Isa's death. Several weeks before the murder, the FBI's surveillance recorded this telephone conversation between Zane and his relative, in which they discussed ways to make Tina's death look like an accident.
As you have said, she threatened me and I killed her.
She threatened me, and I'll put the knife in her hand after she falls. Leave the story to me.
5 hours before Tina's death, Zane called his daughter from a previous marriage.
One can fight the whole world, but who wants to fight an enemy in your own house?
When the news comes to me, I will put on my best dress and go out. My worries will be gone forever.
In the Middle East, shame is something which is felt collectively by a family. It is the discovery of the act. You've done something bad. The community knows about it. Your entire family is shamed.
The tapes reveal the Isas were angry Tina took a job at a fast food restaurant without their approval, and they were also upset she continued to date her boyfriend. When Tina arrived home, this was the welcome from her mother.
That's going to be the last time she's ever going to leave that apartment.
Zane and Maria then confronted Tina about her boyfriend. The argument escalates. The evidence suggests Zane went into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. Tina then screams, pleading with her mother to help.
Tina pleading, "Mother, please help me. Mother, can't you make him stop?"
And then he said, "Die, my daughter, die," when she was dying. Maria held Tina while Zane stabbed her to death.
And the telltale signs was the mother's response. What help? No. Shut up.
Nowhere on the tape did Tina demand $5,000, and there was no reference to Tina having a knife. The tape also reveals the Isas waited for close to 30 minutes to call police after the murder. Zane and Maria Isa were both charged with first-degree murder.
Sir, what did your brother say to you?
You know, with all the respect, I do respect the news media, but I think you're overdoing it.
Authorities speculated that the Isas were afraid of what Tina might reveal to others had there been a permanent rift in the family.
This indictment alleges that there were other reasons because of her knowledge of their terrorist activity.
And her plans to talk about those activities.
They're concerned that she might talk about it.
Ellen Harris wrote a book about this case called Guarding the Secrets.
The prosecution offered Zane a deal that if he pled guilty to murder in the first degree, they would go lighter on Maria, and he refused to do so. So he had no interest in saving his own wife.
After hearing the tapes and the medical examiner's report, the jury found Zane and Maria Isa guilty. They were both sentenced to death. Zane died in prison of natural causes in 1998 before his execution could be carried out. Maria's death sentence was later reversed on a technicality, but she will spend the rest of her life in prison without parole. As for Tina Isa, those who knew her are left to mourn.
Tina was a natural-born leader. She would have done great things for this community and the Arab community had she lived.
Had it not been for Zane Isa's suspected ties to terrorism, the prosecutor's theory about what happened to Tina Isa would have been just that. But the audio tape proved what many jurists would have found difficult to accept.
You can hear in her voice, her parents were murdering her. There's not a whole lot you can say. It's just, as I said earlier, the most horrifying thing I ever hoped to hear, and it's incomprehensible.
It's the kind of thing that once you hear it, you cannot forget it. And once you hear it, you don't want to hear it again.
The medical examiner did not hear the audio tape until sometime after the trial. But he wasn't surprised by what it revealed.
I was able to parallel the information that was provided on the tapes with information that I simply saw with my own eyes looking at the dead body on the morning that I did the autopsy. As far as I'm concerned, that's intentional homicide.
A mysterious computer crash pushes a thriving manufacturing company to the brink of collapse, jeopardizing the jobs of dozens of employees. There is no apparent cause, no obvious clues. forensic investigators had to find out whether the disaster was caused by a computer defect, human error, or sabotage. Today, there are over 700 million computers at work in the world. Any one of those holds millions of records vital to people, governments, and industries. But millions of pieces of information in one small box can make that information vulnerable. Omega Engineering manufactured high-tech measurement devices for the United States Navy, NASA, and clients around the world to quickly customize their products to suit their customers' needs. The business was growing and revenues were up. Then came July 31st, 1996.
It was a bad day at Omega on July 31st of 96. One of their workers got in about 8:30 in the morning, went to his or her workstation like they always did, and they flipped on the system. They booted up the computer. And instead of coming on, though, it said fixing. And the worker didn't know what was going on, but fixing sounded pretty positive, so he let it run. And within seconds, the machine was down.
But it wasn't that one machine that was in trouble. The manufacturing equipment at Omega got its instructions from the computer server, the brains of a sophisticated system that could store over 1,000 different programs.
Those 1,000 programs built 25,000 different products, and they could customize those products into 500,000 different pieces. So you're talking about everything that the company could make.
But now, in the span of just a few seconds, Omega's vital computer system had crashed. The plant's manager tried to get the server up and running again, with no luck. Typically, crucial files are periodically copied from a server onto a backup tape. Omega thought they could restore the missing programs from their backup.
And the backup tape was kept in a filing cabinet in the Human Resources office.
But the tape wasn't there. With no computer programs to drive the manufacturing process, plant operators had only one option: to complete the jobs that had already been started before the crash.
Just to keep the machines running, to keep producing, to keep people working. They just kept producing until they ran out of raw materials.
But they ultimately created such a vast inventory of those specific items that they couldn't justify continuing anymore, so they had to shut the plant down.
One big problem that Omega had was that they hadn't hired a new network administrator.
The former network administrator, a longtime employee named Tim Lloyd, was now working for another company.
He was the one who actually built the network in the Omega South plant. He was the genesis of their whole network. He knew it inside and out, he built it, and he was friends with these people.
He was the designer for all the computer programming. He was the overseer of their network. He maintained it, he secured it, he nurtured it.
The plant manager, Jim Ferguson, called Lloyd to see if he could help solve the serious problem with Omega's computer system.
Did you come across any, you mentioned that you might want to look in the you were going to look in the basement for some old tapes, some backup tapes?
Still looking.
Okay. Was there one tape or two tapes of backups?
There was one tape that was in the filing cabinet.
Right.
Omega was teetering on the brink of collapse, with hundreds of jobs at stake and no clues about what had caused the catastrophic shutdown of the computers. Omega Engineering faced a crisis so immense it could force the company out of business. 2 weeks earlier, the computer system that contained the plans for all their products had inexplicably crashed. Time was running out. If Omega couldn't get its computer system back up, layoffs would be inevitable.
What they lost was the ability to manufacture. And when you're a manufacturing company, you're dead in the water.
Omega hired Kroll On Track, a Minnesota-based company that resurrects data from crashed computers all over the world.
Any kind of media that actually you store data onto, anytime they lose access to this or for some reason becomes unreadable, we get involved to help restore the data.
Bob Hackett, a computer forensic expert, began by examining the hard drive on Omega's server. It's the heart of a computer where information is magnetically encoded on a disk spinning at 10,000 revolutions per minute.
Physically, the hardware, which could be the hard drive or any of the components used to power or drive the hardware, could have failed, but everything seemed to be operational.
The drive was physically undamaged, but retrieving the data would mean examining the electronic contents that might reveal important evidence. But Omega management now wondered if the crash might have been sabotage. So to safeguard the hard drive, they turned it over to the Secret Service. Experts in computer fraud, the Secret Service knew hunting for the lost programs might alter records on the drive. Even just turning on a computer alters or overwrites some of the information.
From a forensic standpoint, you don't want to write to that hard drive.
The Secret Service made an exact digital replica of Omega's hard drive, a clone that enabled OnTrack to examine all the data stored in the original. What OnTrack investigators discovered was startling. All that remained was fragmented computer code, mostly unintelligible even to computer experts. This indicated the programs had not been simply deleted. Deleting a computer file erases only the name of the file. The data actually remains in the computer's memory until it is replaced by something else, so it's often possible to recover the information. But in this case, investigators discovered that Omega's programs had not only been deleted, they had also been purged.
If we take the analogy of a piece of paper on a desk, if I was to take that, crumple it up, and throw it in the wastebasket, that would be equivalent to a deletion on a computer system. I could still go grab that piece of paper out of the garbage can, unfold it, and look at it. A purge would take that same piece of paper, run it through a shredder, take what came out through the shredder, throw it up in the air.
Omega's data could never be recovered. The focus now shifted to a forensic investigation into how and why the data was purged. Greg Olson, an expert in the operating system used by Omega, examined the drive for signs of a virus. A virus corrupts data by inserting its own code into whatever program is being run.
There are no viruses that would cause this particular damage.
User error was another possibility, an accidental deletion.
Very common, we find that a data loss has happened because a computer system, system administrators come in and reinstalled an operating system or made a mistake by reformatting a hard drive. And I was able to rule that out effectively by looking at the system, that clearly that did not happen.
Because the deletion was too surgical to be accidental. Only the key manufacturing programs had been destroyed. If it was intentional, it could mean it was an inside job.
They would have to know where these specific programs were being kept. It's not going to be some kid home alone after school who just randomly breaks into Omega's system and knows where those specific files are. You need someone who's on the inside, someone who knows where the keys to the castle are hidden, and they know how to hurt the company.
The Secret Service first looked at Tim Lloyd, the man who had designed Omega's computer system. He had recently left Omega for a job at another company. Supervisors had given him a positive reference.
They said he was a good worker. They said that he was excellent technically. They didn't want to prevent him from getting another job.
Lloyd had left Omega 3 weeks before the computer crash, so he didn't have access to the building to purge the manufacturing programs on the day of the crash.
They were kind of in a quandary as to who else besides him could have done it. They thought maybe he hacked in from the outside, but they said that they had disconnected any contact from an outside modem, so they knew that couldn't have been done.
Only supervisors had access to Omega's computer system at a level necessary to cause this much damage. But there was a problem.
Just about everybody had supervisory rights, and there were even some accounts that were set up with a name like 12345. It's a really strange name with absolutely no password. So there was no security on this.
Which meant that the perpetrator could have been anyone. 6 months after the massive computer crash, Omega was struggling to stay afloat. How had its proprietary software been completely deleted? Troll On Track's Greg Olson, an expert in the Novell operating system that controlled the server, sifted the electronic flotsam of the company's hard drive.
The problem is when you do a delete and a purge, the entire roadmap to know where this data is completely gone. So it's literally a needle in the haystack and impossible to piece this information together. All you're seeing is a collection of letters and numbers that don't really mean anything.
Olson relied on sophisticated software to help him search for any suspicious commands.
What I'm looking for is bits of code that I know in the computer world cause deletion. In this particular case, what I was zeroing in on was any type of a delete or even any type of a purge. So from here, let's continue our search for purge.
Now we have a hit.
Where I really hit gold was when I started taking hits on the search for purge.
Eventually, Olson found a purge command tied to 5 other lines of code.
That one's 73096. All 6 lines of these code are essentially what caused it. Login 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It was a dangerously efficient bit of programming.
We called it a time bomb, and the actual fuse was 6 lines of code. And what it was is really a set of steps that the computer would go through, some checks.
The first line simply checked the date and compared it to July 30th, 1996, the day before the server crash.
This fuse can be attached to anybody that's logging in. So when you come in, what the fuse does is it checks the date. And if it's after the date in the fuse, it would actually light the time bomb to actually do the deletion.
The second line of code accessed the server. The third line was a logon command for the mysterious user 12345, a kind of computer ghost. The unsuspecting user and 12345 were logged in on the same machine. But 12345 provided the supervisory status needed to perform deletions. The next line accessed the manufacturing programs. The fifth line launched a program labeled fix.exe. When Olson looked at the code for this program, he found a troubling clue. The code had been generated from a commonly available deletion program, but it had been reconfigured to fool anyone using the system.
It did modify the intention of deletion, but the message that appears on the screen that would normally say deleting this file, actually said fixing this file, fixing this file.
The code was also rewritten to ignore safeguards, automatically answering yes to the question, "Are you sure you want to delete these files?" The last line of code was the purge command, making the material unrecoverable.
It would happen relatively fast. You could go get a cup of coffee, read the front page of the paper, and come back and it's all done. It's all gone.
And all the user had to do was turn on the computer. But Olson and Hackett found other purge commands as well.
That one has a test directory in it.
3 similar sets of code dated for February, April, and May. But they only deleted a useless test folder, which would have gone undetected by the company.
What I deduced from that is essentially somebody was doing some testing of the application, this particular time bomb, to make sure that it would work before it was truly implemented and ready to go.
It appeared the tests were done while Omega's former computer manager, Tim Lloyd, was still at the company. The Secret Service ran a background check and learned that Lloyd had been disciplined for run-ins with co-workers shortly before leaving the company.
There was conflict that broke out between other employees, between management, between supervisors.
He would bottleneck projects just because he wasn't in charge of the projects, that he hadn't tested projects before they went into production, and so there were a lot of problems. One person even testified that he had elbowed a female coworker in the workplace.
On August 21st, Secret Service agents searched Lloyd's home and garage, looking for evidence to tie him to the malicious code. They found circuit boards, computers, more than 500 disks, several hard drives, and data tapes. What immediately stuck out was a tape labeled Backup, with the dates May 14, 1996 and July 1st, 1996. Authorities suspected it was the missing backup tape from Omega, but it was blank.
The dates that we found on some of the tapes had a format date of early August.
We learned that the backup tape had been reformatted or essentially erased a matter of days before the search warrant was executed. The next thing we had to do was try to establish additional evidence that would support our theory that Lloyd was the guy. So what we did was, for example, we went to his time cards.
Lloyd's time card showed that he worked late on days in February, April, and May, each time just prior to the test runs of the time bomb. Then Hackett and Olson found a copy of the time bomb on one of Lloyd's hard drives.
So the same lines of code that OnTrack had pieced together from the downed server, they found those lines intact in Tim's home.
A relatively new statute made computer sabotage a federal offense if it affected a computer used in interstate commerce and caused more than $5,000 worth of damage. Tim Lloyd was indicted by a grand jury. His case would be the first test of the new law. Prosecutors in New Jersey say the computer crash devastated Omega Engineering, leading to $10 million of lost business, $2 million of reprogramming costs, and 80 employee layoffs.
Probably would have done less damage to the company if he had done it with a real bomb.
Doesn't matter really what happens to the building if your data is gone.
It is a white-collar crime, but it's a very serious crime. It's a nonviolent crime, but you know what? You don't know what the implications are of people losing their jobs. Maybe there was violence that occurred as a result of some of these folks losing their jobs, maybe domestic violence.
Timothy Lloyd's 4-week trial began in April 1998. It would be one of the first criminal cases to explore the arcane world of computer code.
How would an attorney who hadn't before this had a lot of technical expertise go into a really high-tech field and explain it to a jury? You're not going to show them fingerprints, you're not going to show them a smoking gun or a bag of Coke.
At trial, prosecutors argued that Lloyd had fallen out of favor with his supervisors and grown resentful when he was reassigned. Investigators had been able to prove that Lloyd developed the time bomb code at home, then worked late so that he could install and test the code in secret. He planned on quitting and was in the process of interviewing with another company when he was fired. In fact, he told a recruiter at his new company that everybody's job at Omega is in jeopardy. He made the remark on July 31st, the same day the computer crashed.
How would he know that? On the day that that time bomb, nobody even at Omega knew that. They thought they had a computer problem, that's all they knew. But everybody's job, I think that was a remarkable find and something that the jurors were able to pick up on.
But the most compelling evidence was the bits of code the computer experts found.
And to have this maliciously damage and delete and purge all the data from this point without really having any idea that this was actually happening, and to do it in such a short and quick fashion was very clever.
And he was gone. Being fired actually helped him, and he probably sat back there and said, now they'll never connect me to this. But we were able to find a hard drive in his house that had that command on it. Had we not found that, then he would have gotten away with it. Once you find it at his house, how do you explain that away?
The jury found Lloyd guilty. Various appeals kept him free for almost 4 years. But in 2002, he began serving a prison term of 3.5 years and ordered to pay $2 million in restitution. Lloyd claims he is innocent and that someone at Omega accidentally deleted the programs. He says he could have proved that at trial, but his attorney advised him not to take the stand.
He's the consummate egotist. I think he is absolutely livid that he was discovered. I think that he was fully intent on getting away with it. In fact, I think consistent with his personality, he was actually prepared, perhaps, to ride to the rescue. I think that there was a point in time when he was actually prepared to say, I found it, and I'll ride to the rescue. But I think when Ferguson says we're bringing in the Secret Service.
We're at a very, very serious stage. We're actually bringing in the federal authorities at this point. Yeah, I don't blame you one bit. Yeah, they've taken a real genuine interest in coming in here. Matter of fact, they may be in tomorrow.
I think that that changed his mind.
Omega Engineering never fully recovered, but is still in business. Kroll on Track was given an award by the Secret Service for the unique role they played in a case that paved new legal ground.
It was interesting simply because it was one of the first cases of its type, that we had seen.
Omega made a lot of technical mistakes, but their biggest mistakes were caused by human factors. It was because they trusted Tim. It was because they had real affection for Tim, and they thought that he was family. And you let family get away with a lot more than you would anybody else. You give them a lot more rope to hang themselves with.
A single forgotten clue had survived for 48 years. Not a confession, not a fingerprint, not a dramatic piece of evidence hidden beneath the floor. Just one detail written in the margin of an old police report. And in 2026, that detail would finally point investigators toward an arrest. In the summer of 1978, the small Kentucky community surrounding the town of Ashbury was the kind of place where people noticed unfamiliar cars, where neighbors knew which porch light belonged to which family, where a strange face could become the subject of conversation before sunset. That summer, 24-year-old Laura Bennett disappeared. She was supposed to meet her mother for dinner. She never arrived. Her car was found the next morning beside an abandoned service road outside town. The driver's door was open. Her purse was still inside. Her keys were gone. And on the passenger seat was a folded piece of paper containing 3 words. Don't trust him. Police never discovered who Laura meant. For 48 years, that sentence remained one of the strangest clues in a case that had gradually become part of Kentucky's cold case history. There were suspects. There were rumors. There were failed searches. There were anonymous calls. There were men questioned and released. There were families who stopped talking. And there was one detective who never believed the case was truly dead. His name was Frank Dawson. He was young when Laura disappeared, 30 years old. New to homicide investigation, he spent months trying to understand what had happened. He interviewed Laura's friends, her coworkers, her neighbors, the people she had dated, the people she had argued with, the people who claimed they had never met her. One name kept appearing: Calvin Rusk, 35, mechanic, divorced, quiet. He had worked at a garage near the service road. He knew Laura, not well, but enough to know her routine. He told police he had seen her on the evening she disappeared. Then he changed his story. At first, he said he had been at home. Later, he admitted he had been working late. Then he claimed he had seen Laura's car near the service road, but had never spoken to her. The contradictions were obvious, but there was no physical evidence. No body, no weapon, no witnesses willing to testify. No forensic technology capable of turning a faint clue into certainty. Rusk was questioned. He denied killing Laura. He passed a polygraph. He returned home. And the investigation stalled. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Laura's family searched every road around Ashburn. They posted photographs. They called hospitals. They checked jails. They searched the woods. They waited. Then, 3 months after Laura vanished, a hunter found a piece of fabric near a creek. It belonged to Laura. The discovery changed the case. Search teams entered the area. They found several personal items: a shoe, a broken necklace, a section of blue fabric, but no body. The creek was searched repeatedly. Nothing. The investigators believed Laura had been killed, but without remains, proving what happened became almost impossible. The case slowly faded. New crimes demanded attention. People moved away. Witnesses died. Records disappeared. The garage where Rusk worked closed. The service road was eventually abandoned, and Laura Bennett became a name on a file that fewer and fewer people remember. But the file remained. So did the note. Don't trust him. For decades, detectives wondered who him was. Laura's former boyfriend? Her co-worker? Rusk? Someone else? Then, in 2024, a retired archivist began digitizing old police records. Among thousands of pages was a brittle report dated August 1978. Near the bottom was a handwritten notation. It had been overlooked for decades. 3 words. Blue pickup again. The archivist flagged it. A cold case detective noticed it. And suddenly, the investigation began moving again, because the original witness who had written those words had never been interviewed about them. He had been a gas station attendant. His name was Raymond Cole. He had died in 1996, but his original statement survived. The detective read, then read it again. Raymond had reported seeing a blue pickup near the service road on the night Laura disappeared. He remembered the truck because its right rear tail light was cracked. He remembered because the driver had purchased gasoline. He remembered because Laura Bennett had been sitting in the passenger seat, alive. The report had been filed, but the clue was never followed. The detectives searched vehicle registrations from 1978. There were dozens of blue pickup trucks, but only one registered in the Ashbury area had a cracked rear taillight documented in an insurance report that same month. The owner was Calvin Rusk. The case suddenly had a vehicle, a witness, a suspect, and a clue that had been sitting untouched for almost 5 decades. Investigators located Rusk's surviving family. Rusk himself had died in 2011. He had never been arrested, never charged, never publicly identified as the killer, but his belongings remained with his dog. Old photographs, tools, documents, and a box of personal items from the garage. Investigators obtained permission to examine them. Inside was an old mechanic's jacket, dark blue, faded. The sleeve was torn. A small piece of fabric was missing. The detective compared it with the blue fabric found near the creek in 1978. The material appeared similar, but investigators knew similarity was not enough. They sent both samples to a modern laboratory. The result came back weeks later. The fibers were consistent. Not identical, not definitive, but consistent. Then came something stronger, a photograph. Taken in July 1978, Laura was standing outside the garage. Beside her was Rusk. On the ground behind them was the same blue pickup. The cracked taillight was visible. The photograph had been taken 3 weeks before Laura disappeared. Rusk had told police he barely knew her. The photograph suggested otherwise. The detective looked at Laura's note again. Don't trust him. Could him have been Rusk? The investigators did not know, but the timeline was becoming difficult to ignore. On the night Laura vanished, Rusk claimed he left the garage at 6:30. The gas station record placed his truck near the service road after 7 o'clock. Laura was supposed to meet her mother at 7:30. She never arrived. At 8:12, Rusk returned home. At 8:31, Laura's mother called her apartment. No answer. At 9:05, the family reported her missing. By sunrise, her car had been found, and Rusk had already changed his story. The investigators reopened every interview. They discovered another contradiction. Rusk had told police Laura never entered his truck, but Raymond Cole's statement said she was sitting inside it. The old witness was dead. Rusk was dead. The truth seemed trapped between them. Then investigators found something else, a repair invoice, dated August 18th, 1978, 2 days after Laura disappeared. The invoice showed Rusk had replaced the cracked rear taillight. Why? Because the light was broken. The detective searched the original photographs of Laura's abandoned car. There was damage on the rear bumper. Fresh damage. The angle suggested another vehicle had struck it. A blue vehicle. possibly a pickup. The case had just acquired a collision, and suddenly the forgotten clue was no longer forgotten. It was pointing somewhere. The question was whether it pointed to the truth or toward another dead end, because after 48 years, one thing remained certain. Laura Bennett had disappeared. Someone had seen her alive. Someone had lied. And somewhere in Kentucky, the answer had been waiting in an old file that almost nobody remembered existed. The old report changed the direction of the investigation, but it did not answer the most important question. Where had Laura gone after she was seen inside Calvin Rusk's blue pickup? Investigators knew the truck had been near the service road. They knew Laura had been inside it. They knew the vehicle had suffered damage. They knew Rusk had replaced the taillight 2 days later. But none of that proved murder. A cold case could not be solved with suspicion. The detectives needed something physical, something that could survive a courtroom. So they returned to the place where Laura's car had been found. The service road looked completely different in 2026. The old gravel path had almost disappeared beneath weeds. Trees had grown around the edge. A new highway had been constructed less than a mile away. The gas station was gone. The abandoned warehouse was gone. Even the creek looked narrower than it had in 1978, but the investigators had old photographs. They had maps. They had measurements. They reconstructed the area exactly as it had been 48 years earlier. Then they found something unexpected. The original search map contained a section investigators had never searched, a narrow strip of woodland behind the old maintenance shed. It had been marked in red pencil. Beside it were the words, "Too unstable." The detective stared at the notation. The area had been considered dangerous because the ground was soft. Search teams had avoided it. Nobody had returned. For nearly 5 decades, a modern ground-penetrating radar unit was brought in. The equipment moved slowly across the ground. Nothing. Then a signal appeared. The technician stopped. He scanned again. The same shape. Approximately 4 feet beneath the surface. The detective looked at the map. The location was less than 200 yards from where Laura's car had been discovered. A forensic excavation began. Layer by layer, the soil was removed. The team found old metal, a rusted tool, pieces of glass, animal bones, then something white, human bone. The excavation stopped immediately. The entire area was secured. More fragments were discovered. Then a section of fabric, blue, the same color investigators had been searching for since 1978. The laboratory confirmed the remains belonged to Laura Bennett. After 48 years, the missing woman had finally been found. Her family was notified. The news spread through Ashbury within hours. The woman whose photograph had appeared on missing person posters for decades had finally been located. But the discovery created a new question. How had she died? The forensic examination found trauma to the skull. There were fractures inconsistent with a simple fall. There were also injuries to the rib. The medical examiner could not determine the exact weapon, but one thing became clear. Laura had not died from natural causes. She had been killed. The cold case had become a homicide investigation, and suddenly every old statement mattered. The detectives returned to Calvin Rusk's. They found something buried inside it. A photograph of Rusk's blue pickup, taken after the repair. The date was August 18th, 1978. The truck's rear bumper had been replaced. The taillight was new. But the original insurance report described something else. The damage was not limited to the taillight. There had been blood on the bumper. The insurance adjuster had written, "Owner claims animal collision." The detective read the sentence again, "Animal collision." But Laura's blood had never been tested against the vehicle, because in 1978, investigators did not have the technology. The truck had been destroyed years earlier. There was nothing left to test, or so they thought. Rusk's daughter remembered an old metal toolbox from the garage. She said her father kept everything: receipts, bolts, keys, old repair parts. She brought the box to investigators. Inside was a small envelope. A handwritten label read, "Truck 78." Inside were several photographs. One showed the damaged bumper. Another showed the broken taillight. And one showed the rear seat. There was a dark stain on the upholstery. Investigators had no way to know whether the stain belonged to Laura, but they had something better: a swatch of the original upholstery. Rusk had kept it after replacing the seat. The fabric was carefully packaged. Forensic scientists tested it. The result was extraordinary. The sample contained degraded biological material. The DNA was incomplete, but investigators were able to extract a partial profile. It was consistent with Laura Bennett. The laboratory repeated the test. Same result. A third test produced the same conclusion. The blood from Laura's body had likely been transferred to Rusk's. The detective sat in the laboratory reviewing the report. For decades, the case had lacked one connection. Now there was one. Laura, the truck, Rusk, the service road, the creek, the body. Everything was beginning to connect, but investigators still needed to understand what happened after Laura entered the truck. They searched the original witness statements. Most were useless, but one witness had described seeing the truck later that night. Her name was Evelyn Price. She had been 17 in 1978. She was driving home from work. She remembered seeing a blue pickup near the creek. At the time, she thought nothing of it, but investigators had never asked her about it. She had moved out of Kentucky decades earlier. They located her in another state. She agreed to speak. Her memory was surprisingly clear. She remembered the truck because the rear taillight was broken. She remembered the location because the road was normally empty. And she remembered something else. The driver's door was open. A man was standing outside. She could not see his face, but she saw someone lying on the ground near the creek. The detective asked, "Did you see the person?" Evelyn nodded. "I thought it was a woman. Could you see her clothing?" "She was wearing something blue." The interview stopped there. The investigators now had a second witness placing Rusk's truck near the creek, and a body had been found nearby. The defense would argue that memories after 48 years were unreliable, but the prosecution would not depend on Evelyn alone. They had physical evidence. They had the vehicle connection. They had the old witness statement. They had Rusk's contradictory account. They had the note. They had the repair records. And now they had Laura's remains. Still, one mystery remained. Who wrote the words, "Don't trust him"? Investigators believed Laura had written the note. The handwriting matched samples from her workplace. But which man was she referring to? The detectives examined her final day. They found a diary. It had been recovered from her apartment in 1978. The original investigators had barely examined it. Several pages were missing. But one entry remained. August 14th. Laura had written, "Calvin knows." The next line had been crossed out. Then, "He says he can fix it." Another entry. August 15th. "I don't believe him." August 16th. "He followed me again." Then nothing. The final entry was dated August 17th, the day before she disappeared. Only 4 words. "I know who did." The sentence ended there. Investigators wondered whether Laura had discovered who was stealing the equipment. Maybe Rusk. Maybe someone else. They searched her financial records. They found payments from a company connected to Rusk. Small amounts. $100, $200, $150. None large enough to attract attention, but they occurred regularly. The payments stopped 1 week before Laura disappeared. The investigators reconstructed the business relationship. Laura had worked as a bookkeeper. She had access to invoices. She could see the money. She may have discovered that equipment was being stolen. Rusk was one of the people handling it. But investigators found another name, Walter Crane, a local contractor. Crane had died in 1993. He had owned the company that purchased the stolen equipment. His name appeared repeatedly in Laura's records. The detective wondered whether Rusk had acted alone. The answer appeared in another forgotten document, a bank record. 3 days before Laura disappeared, Rusk deposited $7,500 in cash. 2 days later, Crane withdrew $7,500. The amounts matched. Investigators followed the money. The transaction had been flagged in 1978, but never investigated. Why? Because the bank clerk had assumed it was a business payment. Now it looked different. The detectives examined Crane's old property records. He owned land near the creek, a cabin, and a storage shed. The cabin was less than half a mile from where Laura's remains were found. The investigators returned to the location. The cabin was gone, but the foundation remained. So did an old well. A forensic team searched it. Nothing. Then they examined the storage shed. The building had been demolished decades earlier, but its concrete foundation contained a metal drain. Inside the drain was a rusted object, a bracelet. Laura's bracelet. The same bracelet described in the original missing person report. The evidence had been sitting there for nearly half a century. The investigators now believed Laura had been taken to the property. But who killed her? Rusk? Crane? Both? The evidence suggested Rusk had been physically present, but the financial records suggested Crane had a motive. Then investigators found the most important clue of all, a photograph. It had been taken at a company picnic in July 1978. Laura stood near a table. Behind her were Rusk and Crane. The two men were talking. On the table was a stack of business files. One of those files was labeled with Laura's initials. The photograph had been taken weeks before the murder, but investigators enlarged the image. There was something in Rusk's hand, a folded piece of paper. The same distinctive blue paper found inside Laura's abandoned car. The detective stared at the image, then compared it with the original note. The paper fibers matched. The note had been inside Laura's car. Rusk had possessed the same paper. The connection was not proof of murder, but it was another piece, another thread. And now the detectives began asking a different question. What if the note had never been written for the police? What if Laura had written it for someone she trusted? What if "don't trust him" was not a warning about Rusk? What if she meant Crane? That possibility changed the entire theory. Laura may have discovered the theft. She may have confronted Crane. Rusk may have been involved, and someone may have killed her to protect the operation. The detective returned to Laura's diary. The missing pages suddenly became critical. Investigators contacted the Bennett family. They searched old boxes, old furniture, attics, basements. They found nothing. Then Laura's niece remembered something. Her grandmother had kept a small wooden jewelry box. It had belonged to Laura. The box had been stored for decades. Inside were photographs, a ring, a dried flower, and a folded page. The page had been torn from Laura's diary. The missing page. The handwriting was hers. The date was August 18th, the day she disappeared. The words were short, but they changed everything. If anything happens to me, ask about the blue truck. The detective read the sentence 3 times. Then he placed the page beside the 1978 report. The forgotten clue was no longer a clue. It was a warning. Laura had known the truck mattered. She had known something was about to happen. And somehow, despite everything the years had erased, she had left one final instruction behind. Ask about the blue truck. So investigators did, and the answer led directly back to Calvin Rusk. The name Calvin Rusk had been sitting inside the original case file for almost half a century, but now it was no longer just the name of a mechanic who had once known Laura Bennett. It was attached to a vehicle, a location, a financial trail, a witness statement, a damaged taillight, biological evidence, and one sentence written by Laura herself on the final page she ever completed. If anything happens to me, ask about the blue truck. That sentence changed the investigation because it suggested Laura had not been guessing. She had been warning someone. The problem was that Laura had never written exactly what she knew. She had left investigators a direction, not an answer. So the detectives followed it. The blue truck. They began with every surviving record connected to Calvin Rusk's vehicle. The original registration showed a 1974 Chevrolet pickup, dark blue, long bed, white interior. The truck had been purchased secondhand 3 years before Laura disappeared. Rusk had registered it in his own name. The insurance records showed several repairs. One of them stood out. August 18th sill, 1978. The rear taillight, the bumper, and the upholstery. Investigators already knew about the taillight. Now they focused on the upholstery. Why had the rear seat been replaced? The repair invoice simply said, interior damage. No explanation. No accident report. No details. The original mechanic who performed the repair had died, but his son still operated the same family business. He remembered his father keeping old work order. The son searched through boxes, years of dust, old receipts, rusting carbon copies. Then he found the original repair ticket. The paper was brittle. The ink was fading. But the description was clearer than the copy in the police file. Rear seat soaked, strong odor. Customer requests replacement immediately. The detective stopped reading. Soaked with what? The son didn't know. His father had never written it. But the word blood appeared faintly beneath the original line. It looked like someone had started writing it and then stopped. The investigator photographed the document, then searched the insurance file. The insurance adjuster had made a note. Customer claims animal strike. No animal recovered. That made no sense. An animal collision could damage a taillight. It could damage a bumper. But why would the rear seat be soaked? And why would the driver need the interior replaced immediately? The investigators reconstructed the truck. They compared the location of the bloodstain with the position of the rear seat. They believed Laura may have been moved into the back, alive or dead. The distinction mattered. If she had been alive, the truck could have been the vehicle used to transport her from the apartment. If she had already been dead, Russ could have been moving her body. The forensic evidence could not establish the exact time, but the witness statement from Raymond Cole changed the equation. He had seen Laura alive inside the truck. That meant she had entered it before her death. The investigators searched for every person who had been near the gas station that night. Most were dead. Some had moved. Some remembered nothing. One surviving customer did remember the truck. His name was Gerald Mason. He had been 22 at the time. He was buying cigarettes when he saw Rusk's pickup. He remembered Laura. He remembered because she was arguing with someone. The investigator asked, "Who?" Gerald said, "Calvin." What were they arguing about? I couldn't hear. Did Laura look afraid? Gerald hesitated. Yes. How do you remember that after 48 years? Gerald looked down. Because she looked straight at me. That sentence changed the mood of the interview. Gerald said Laura looked at him for several seconds. He believed she wanted him to notice her. He said she seemed to be trying to communicate without speaking. The investigator asked what happened next. Gerald said Rusk got out of the truck. He walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door. Laura stopped looking at Gerald. Then the truck left. Gerald never reported the encounter. He assumed it was a private argument. He had no idea she would disappear hours later. Now investigators had another witness, another person placing Laura inside Rusk's truck, and another reason to believe she was afraid. But investigators still needed to establish why Rusk would kill her. The answer appeared in the financial records. The stolen equipment operation was larger than anyone had realized. Dozens of machines, tools, construction materials, parts. The losses were substantial. The money moved through several businesses. One was controlled by Walter Crane, another was linked to Richard Hale, and one account belonged to Calvin Rusk. Rusk was not simply a mechanic. He was a middleman. He received stolen equipment, changed identification numbers, repaired machinery, then helped move it to buyers. Laura had access to the invoices. She could see discrepancies. She could see machines listed twice. She could see payments that had no matching delivery, and she had begun copying them. That was the motive. But another question remained. Why would Rusk take such a risk? The answer may have been money. A payment made to Rusk 4 days before Laura disappeared was exactly $12,000. That amount was enormous in 1978. The payment came from an account controlled by Walter Crane. The description read, "Special Service." Investigators had no doubt that the phrase was deliberately vague. The payment was followed by a second transfer, $3,500, then another, $2,000, all within 6 days. Laura disappeared on the 8th. The money stopped. The financial timeline was almost impossible to ignore. The detectives now believed Laura had discovered the operation at exactly the moment Rusk was receiving the largest payments. Then they found something else. A telephone record. At 6:42 p.m. on August 18th, Laura called Rusk's garage. The call lasted 11 minutes. Nobody knew what they discussed, but Rusk had previously told investigators Laura had not spoken to him that day. He had lied. The call proved it. The detectives searched the original interview. Rusk had said, "I hadn't talked to her in weeks." Now they knew that statement was false. The investigators began reconstructing the final hour. 6:42 p.m. Laura calls Rusk. 7:05. Laura leaves her apartment. 7:18. She is seen near the gas station. 7:23. Rusk's truck leaves the area. 7:35. Laura's mother expects her for dinner. 7:41. A witness sees the blue truck near the service road. 8:12. Rusk returns home. 8:31. Laura's mother calls her apartment. 9:05. The family reports her missing. Before midnight, Rusk tells a friend she's probably with somebody. That sentence appeared in an old interview. At the time, detectives ignored it. Now it sounded different. How did Rusk know Laura might be with someone? Why would he assume that so quickly? Because he knew she had left. He knew where she was. And perhaps he knew she would not be coming home. The detectives returned to the service road. They brought ground-penetrating radar. They scanned the area again. The location where Laura's body had been discovered was only part of the search. The team widened the grid. Near the old creek bank, they found disturbed soil. The disturbance was decades old, but underneath it was a small metal object. A key. The key was heavily corroded. Investigators photographed it, then cleaned it. A number was stamped into the metal. The number matched a storage unit, not Laura's, Rusk's. The unit had been rented in 1977. Records showed he maintained it until 1981. Investigators located the property. The storage building had been demolished decades earlier, but the former owner had preserved old rental ledgers. Rusk had rented Unit 19. Investigators examined the records. His name appeared repeatedly, but one entry was different. August 19th, Sill, 1978. A handwritten note said, "Customer removed boxes." The boxes were gone, but the investigator wondered where they went. The former property owner remembered something. Rusk had returned the day after Laura disappeared. He had arrived early. He was nervous. He asked to use the unit alone. Then he removed several boxes. The owner remembered because Rusk had never done that before. The investigator asked, "What did the boxes look like?" The owner answered, "Round cardboard, maybe 6 or 7. Did he say what was inside?" "No." "Was anyone with him?" The owner thought for several seconds. "Yes." "Who?" "A man." "Do you remember him?" The owner shook his head. "Not clearly." Then came a strange detail. The man had been wearing a gray work jacket. Investigators searched photographs from the period. One person repeatedly wore a gray work jacket. Walter Crane. The case had just widened. Rusk might not have acted alone. The stolen equipment operation connected him to Crane. The storage unit connected them again. The payment connected them. The property near the creek connected them. And Laura's diary suggested she had discovered something involving the men. The detectives now examined Crane's history. He had been questioned in 1978, but only once. He claimed he had never spoken to Laura. That statement was false. Investigators found a photograph showing Crane at the same business meeting as Laura. They found a telephone record. They found an invoice bearing Laura's initial, and they found a letter. The letter was written by Crane. It was addressed to Rusk. The date was August 17th, one day before Laura disappeared. The letter contained only one sentence. "She knows about the numbers." The investigators stared at it. The numbers. The altered equipment numbers. The invoices. The missing machinery. Laura had discovered the system, and someone knew she had discovered it. But the most chilling part was what appeared beneath the sentence. A handwritten instruction. "Take care of it tonight." The handwriting was Crane. The letter had never been found in 1978. It had been stored among Crane's personal belongings and eventually passed to his son. The son had no idea what it meant. Now investigators did. The timing was almost perfect. August 17th. The warning. August 18th. Laura disappears. August 18th. Rusk receives a payment. August 18th. The truck is seen near the creek. August 19th. Rusk removes boxes from the storage unit. The case had moved beyond coincidence. It was beginning to look like a planned operation. But there was still one problem. Walter Crane was dead. Calvin Rusk was dead. The people who could explain what happened were gone. The prosecution could not arrest the dead, so investigators needed to determine whether anyone living had helped them. They found one name, a former employee named Leonard Price. Price had worked for Crane in 1978. He was still alive, and when investigators showed him the photograph of the blue truck, he immediately recognized it. Then they showed him the photograph of Rusk. Price became silent. The detective asked, "Did Calvin Rusk kill Laura Bennett?" Price did not answer. The detective asked again. Price finally whispered, "I don't know." Then he added, "But I know where they took her." The investigator leaned forward. "Where?" Price pointed toward the map. Not the creek, not the cabin, somewhere else. A property that had never appeared in the original investigation. A barn, 5 miles outside Ashbury. Price said Rusk, and Crane used it to store stolen equipment. He said Laura had been there. He remembered seeing her. He remembered her screaming. And then he said something that made the detective stop the interview. "Calvin told me she wouldn't leave that barn alive." The room went silent. For 48 years, investigators believed the creek was the center of the mystery. Now they had a new location. A barn. A place nobody had searched. A place that might contain the missing evidence. Price agreed to return with investigators. He walked slowly across the property. The barn was gone. Only the foundation remained. He pointed toward a section of earth. Here. Investigators began digging. They found rusted machinery, old chains, a broken wooden crate, then a metal container. Inside was a collection of paper, invoices, payment records, names, dates, and one photograph. Laura Bennett, alive, standing inside the barn. Her face was turned toward the camera. Behind her stood Calvin Rusk, and beside him was Walter Crane. The photograph had been taken shortly before her death, but there was something else. On the back, someone had written, "Last warning." The detective turned the photograph over. For the first time, the case no longer depended on what people remembered. The past had left an image, and the image was staring directly back at them. The photograph changed everything because Laura Bennett was no longer just a name in an old report. She was looking directly into the camera, alive, frightened, and standing inside a place investigators had never searched, the barn. For 48 years, nobody had known it existed. Or, more accurately, nobody had understood what it was. The original 1978 case file contained maps of the area. The barn was nowhere on them. The property had belonged to Walter Crane's company. Officially, it was listed as unused agricultural land. But Leonard Price told investigators it was not unused. It was where stolen equipment was stored. It was where identification numbers were changed. It was where trucks arrived at night. And according to Price, it was where Laura Bennett was taken. The detectives secured the entire property. They brought in forensic archaeologists, ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, cadaver dogs. Every inch of the old foundation was photographed. The photograph of Laura was sealed as evidence. The handwriting on the back was preserved. Last warning. The first excavation began near the eastern wall. Nothing. Then the western side. Nothing. Near the old loading entrance, the radar detected several anomalies. The team dug carefully. They found nails, bolts, broken machinery, then a metal ring embedded in the soil. Under it was a section of concrete. The concrete had been poured later than the rest of the foundation. The investigator looked at the records. The barn had been repaired in September 1978, 1 month after Laura disappeared. That was enough to justify a deeper search. The concrete was removed. Beneath it was a shallow cavity. Inside was a rusted toolbox. The toolbox contained wrenches, screws, a broken flashlight, and a small object wrapped in plastic, a necklace. Laura's necklace, the same necklace described in the original missing person report. The chain was broken. One side contained a small metal pendant. The other was missing. Investigators searched the cavity again. They found the pendant several inches away, then a piece of fabric, then a button. The button matched the shirt Laura had been wearing when she disappeared. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. Laura had been inside the barn. She had been there shortly before her death, but investigators still had to determine exactly what happened. They searched the surviving records from Crane's company. A ledger contained a handwritten entry dated August 18th. It read, CB 730. The initials were unexplained. Then another line, Rusk 8 o'clock. Another, truck out 10:15. The investigators believe the entries described movements on the night Laura disappeared. The timing matched the known timeline. Laura was seen with Rusk around 7 o'clock. Rusk's truck was near the service road shortly afterward. The truck disappeared from witness view, then returned later. The ledger suggested it had been at the barn. Investigators found another entry, creek after midnight. The case suddenly became almost chronological. Laura enters the truck. She is taken to the barn. She is confronted about the documents. Something happened. Her body is moved. The truck travels toward the creek, but there was still one question. Who was responsible for the final act? Leonard Price knew something. The detectives brought him back. This time they showed him the photograph. He stared at it for almost a minute. Then he said, "She knew she was going to die." The investigator asked, "How do you know?" Price answered, "She asked me for help." The room went quiet. "What did you do?" Price looked away. "Nothing." "Why?" "Because Crane had a gun." Price explained that he had entered the barn around 9 o'clock that night. Laura was sitting on the floor. Her hands were tied. Rusk was standing nearby. Crane was holding a handgun. Price said Laura recognized him. She called his name. She begged him to help. He froze. Crane told him to leave. Price obeyed. He walked away. He heard Laura screaming behind him. Then he heard a loud impact. He said he did not know whether it was a gunshot. He never turned around. He left the property. The investigators asked, "Did you see Laura alive?" "Yes." "When?" "About 9 o'clock." "Was she injured?" "Yes." "Was she alive when you left?" "Yes." That testimony established a crucial fact. Laura was alive inside the barn, and both Rusk and Crane were there. The investigators asked whether Whitmore was involved. Price said he had never seen Whitmore at the barn, but he knew Whitmore's name. Everyone did. He was the businessman who controlled the money, the person who arranged the equipment deal, the man who received the stolen machine. Price said Crane often talked about him. Then he remembered something. A phone call. Crane had called Whitmore from the barn. Price heard only one side. Crane said, "She knows." Then, "She has copies." Then, "No, she won't tell us." Then, "We need to finish this tonight." Price said he heard Whitmore's voice through the receiver. He could not make out the words, but Crane became angry. Then he hung up. The detectives now had a possible connection between Whitmore and the barn, but Whitmore had died years earlier. No arrest was possible. The focus shifted back to Rusk. He was alive in 1978. He was at the barn. He owned the truck. He knew Laura. He lied about speaking to her. He had blood inside his truck. He removed boxes from his storage unit the next day. He had received $12,000, and Laura had written, "Ask about the blue truck." The evidence was building toward him, but the prosecution needed a living defendant. Rusk had died in 2011. That created a devastating limitation. Investigators could reconstruct the crime. They could identify the likely killer, but they could not arrest a dead man. The case appeared to be heading toward another dead end. Then detectives discovered that Rusk had a younger brother, Samuel Rusk. He had been 17 in 1978. He was still alive, and he had never been interviewed. Samuel lived quietly in western Kentucky. When detectives arrived, he initially refused to speak. He said he knew nothing. They showed him the photograph. He immediately recognized the barn, then the blue truck, then Laura. His face changed. The detective asked, "Did your brother ever tell you what happened?" Samuel said, "No." The detective waited. Samuel looked at the photograph again, then whispered, "He told me she fought." The detectives asked what he meant. Samuel said Calvin came home late on August 18th. He was covered in mud. His shirt was torn. His hands were shaking. Samuel asked him what happened. Calvin told him, "Nothing you need to know." The next morning, Calvin burned clothing in the backyard. Samuel remembered the smell. He remembered a blue jacket. He remembered his brother cleaning the truck, and he remembered one sentence. Calvin told him, "If anybody asks, I was home all night." Samuel had been 17. He obeyed for 48 years. Then he finally broke his silence. The investigators searched the Rusk family property. The house had been renovated many times, but Samuel still had an old box from his brother. Inside were personal belongings, a watch, a wallet, a mechanic's manual, and a small notebook. The notebook was not a diary. It was a work log. Most entries were meaningless. Oil changes, engine repairs, parts. But August 18th had been written in different ink. The entry read, "Blue truck, creek, 11:45. The detective stared at it. Then the next line. "Crane says keep quiet." The handwriting was confirmed as Calvin. The notebook became one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the reopened case. But there was still more. The investigators returned to the creek. They searched the surrounding area using modern technology. Near an old tree, they found a rusted metal fragment. It was part of a vehicle jack, the same type used in Rusk's truck. The fragment contained traces of old paint, blue. Chemical analysis showed it was consistent with the paint used on Rusk's pickup. Again, not absolute proof, but another connection. The detectives reconstructed the truck's movement. The vehicle left the barn, traveled toward the creek, stopped, then returned. The route matched witness statements. Then they found tire impressions preserved in an old photograph. The original investigator had photographed the creek after Laura's body was discovered. The tire tracks had been considered irrelevant. Modern analysts enlarged them. The tread pattern was distinctive. It matched a 1974 Chevrolet pickup, Rusk's vehicle. The defense was gone. Rusk was dead, but prosecutors still wanted to know whether anyone alive had helped him. They began searching for other participants. One name kept appearing. A truck driver named Ernest Cole. He had worked for Crane. He had been questioned in 1978. He claimed he had never seen Laura, but his employment records showed he had delivered equipment to the barn that week. Investigators found him living under his middle name. When they contacted him, he refused. Then, after learning the case had been reopened, he called them. He asked for protection. He said he was afraid. He told detectives he had seen Laura at the barn. He had seen Rusk. He had seen Crane. And he had seen something else. A fourth man. The man was not Whitmore, not Price, not Samuel. Someone investigators had never considered. Ernest said the man arrived around 10:30 p.m. He drove a black sedan. He carried a suitcase. He entered the barn. 20 minutes later, he left. The investigators asked, "Who was he?" Ernest gave them a name. Thomas Keller, a local attorney. Keller had represented several of Crane's companies. He had been involved in the financial transaction. And according to Ernest, he was the man who arrived with the suitcase. Investigators searched Keller's records. He had died in 2002, but his law firm still existed. Archive files were stored in the basement. A court order allowed investigators to examine them. Inside was a letter. August 19th, Sill, 1978, the day after Laura disappeared. The letter was addressed to Walter Crane. It read, "The situation has been contained. The documents are no longer a concern." The signature was Thomas Keller. The detective read the sentence again. contained. The documents. No longer a concern. It was not a confession. But it was another piece of the puzzle. The investigators now believed the operation was larger than Rusk and Crane. Several people had known. Several had benefited. Several had remained silent. But the person physically connected to Laura remained Calvin Rusk. The blue truck, the blood, the witness, the diary, the photograph, the barn, the notebook, the creek. Everything returned to him. Then investigators made a discovery that would change the case from historical investigation to active criminal prosecution. They found a surviving relative who had possession of one of Rusk's old Cosette tapes. Rusk had recorded conversations while working. Most were ordinary. Customers, suppliers, business calls. But one tape was labeled only with a date, August 18th, Sill, 1978. Investigators played it. Static. Then a door. Footsteps. A woman's voice. Laura. Her voice was faint, but unmistakable. She said, "You can't do this." A man's voice answered, "Rusk, you should have kept your mouth shut." Laura replied, "People know." Rusk, "No one knows anything." Laura, "My sister knows." Silence. Then another man's voice, Crane, "Where are the copies?" Laura refused to answer. The recording ended. Investigators listened again. Then again. The date matched. The location appeared to be the barn, and the voices placed Laura with Rusk and Crane shortly before her death. For 48 years, the case had depended on fragments. Now those fragments were speaking together. The blue truck, the barn, the blood, the ledger, the notebook, the photograph, the diary, the tape, the body. The investigators assembled everything. But there was a problem. Calvin Rusk was dead. Walter Crane was dead. Thomas Keller was dead. The original suspects were gone. The case could not end with an arrest, not unless investigators found someone still alive who had played a direct role. That person was Leonard Price. And after hearing the tape, Price finally changed his story. He admitted he had not merely seen Laura. He had helped move her. He had helped Rusk load her into the truck. He had driven behind them toward the creek. He had watched Rusk bury evidence. He had lied for 48 years. But now he wanted to tell everything, because Price believed he was the last living person who knew exactly what happened that night. And his next statement would reveal the one detail investigators had been missing: the reason Laura had been killed. Not simply because she knew about stolen equipment, not simply because she had copied, but because she had discovered something far more dangerous, a secret involving money, power, and a murder that had happened before her own, a murder that had never been solved. And according to Price, Laura had found the evidence connecting them. That was why she had to disappear, and that was why the blue truck had become her final warning. The room went silent after Leonard Price finished speaking. For nearly half a century he had carried the same secret. He had seen Laura Bennett alive. He had watched Calvin Rusk take her. He had followed the truck. He had helped move evidence. And now, at the end of his life, he was finally saying what Laura had not simply discovered stolen equipment. She had discovered a murder that happened months before she disappeared. Price said Laura had been looking into missing money at the construction company. At first, she believed it was fraud. Then she found a payment connected to a former employee named Michael Grant. Grant had worked for Walter Crane. He disappeared in January 1978. His body was eventually found near a quarry. The death was ruled accidental. But Laura did not believe it. She found inconsistencies in the company records. Grant had been paid $4,000 shortly before his death. The money disappeared. Then Grant disappeared. Laura began comparing his records with the equipment theft. The numbers matched. The same trucks, the same buyers, the same accounts. She believed Grant had discovered the operation, and she believed someone had killed him to keep him quiet. Price told investigators that Laura had confronted Calvin Rusk about it. Rusk denied everything. Then Laura showed him a document. Price did not know exactly what it contained, but he remembered Rusk's reaction. He became furious. He told Laura she did not understand what she had found. Laura answered, "I understand enough." That was when Rusk stopped treating her like a problem. He began treating her like a threat. Price said Laura had copies, 3 copies, one hidden at her apartment, one in the storage locker, and one given to someone she trusted. That person was her sister, Diane. The investigators already knew Diane had received the red folder, but they did not know it contained information about Michael Grant. They reopened Grant's case. His death had occurred 7 months before Laura disappeared. His vehicle had been found near the quarry. There was no evidence of foul play, but now investigators looked at the old photographs again. They noticed damage on the driver's side door. The damage looked like an impact, not an accident. They examined the original autopsy. There was a fracture on Grant's skull. The medical examiner had attributed it to the fall, but modern forensic review suggested the injury may have occurred before the fall. The cold case had just become 2 cases: Michael Grant, Laura Bennett, and a possible connection between them. Investigators searched the company records. They found that Grant had worked directly under Crane. He had access to the same equipment numbers Laura later discovered. He had also complained about missing money. 3 days before his death, Grant wrote a letter to Laura. The letter was never delivered. It had been found among his belongings. The investigators located it in the original evidence archive. The envelope was unopened. Inside, Grant had written, "If anything happens to me, look at the blue truck." The same clue, the same vehicle, the same warning. The detectives stared at the letter. Laura had not invented the connection. Michael Grant had seen it first. He had been afraid. Then he died. Months later, Laura followed the same trail. Then she disappeared. The investigators reconstructed Grant's final day, January 1978. Grant noticed discrepancies in equipment records. He confronted Crane. Crane denied stealing anything. Grant threatened to go to police. The following week, Grant received a cash payment, $4,000. Then he withdrew another $2,000. Then his account was closed. 2 days later, he was dead. The investigators found a witness who had seen Grant with Rusk. The witness was elderly but still alive. She remembered seeing them arguing outside the garage. Grant had pointed at Rusk. Rusk had grabbed his arm. The witness had assumed it was a business dispute. Now it looked different. The detectives asked her what Grant was carrying. A folder. Blue. The same color as the paper Laura later used. The connection was becoming impossible to ignore. Grant discovered the theft. Rusk knew. Laura discovered Grant's death was suspicious. Rusk knew. Both had been connected to the blue truck. Both had threatened to expose the operation. Both disappeared after confronting the same group. The investigators now believed Laura had been killed because she had connected 2 crimes. But why had her body been hidden near the creek? Price finally explained. After Laura was killed inside the barn, Rusk and Crane argued. Crane wanted her buried on the property. Rusk wanted to move her. Price said Rusk was afraid the barn would eventually be searched. They wrapped Laura in a heavy canvas sheet. They loaded her into the blue truck. Price followed in another vehicle. They drove toward the creek. Around midnight, Rusk stopped. They dug. Laura was buried. Then Rusk returned to the barn. Price said he watched him burn paper, the red folder, financial records, photographs, anything connecting the group to Laura. But something survived. One document. Price had taken it. He kept it hidden for decades. The detectives asked where it was. Price said, "In my basement." They searched his home. Behind a false wall, they found a metal box. Inside were documents sealed in plastic. One was a copy of the stolen equipment ledger. Another was a list of payments. Another was a photograph. And one final document. A contract. The contract connected Walter Crane to a shell company. The shell company was controlled by a man named Harold Whitmore, the same name that had appeared in the old investigation. Whitmore had not simply financed the operation. He owned it. The documents showed payments from Whitmore's company to Crane, then from Crane to Rusk, then payments to several other people, including Thomas Keller, and one payment to a police officer. The officer had been involved in the original investigation. He was dead, but the document explained why certain leads had disappeared, why the barn had never been searched, why the blue truck had never been examined, why the original investigators stopped following Russ. The case had not simply failed, it had been obstructed. Someone had interfered. The detectives reviewed every report signed by that officer. One phrase appeared repeatedly: no evidence of criminal activity, even when evidence existed. The original case had been weakened from inside. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. The current chief ordered an internal review. Every surviving officer involved in the case was investigated. Most were dead. One was still alive: retired Sergeant Paul Harlan. He was 92. When detectives showed him the documents, he became visibly upset. He admitted he had been told to stop pursuing Russ. Who told him? Harlan hesitated, then said, Captain Miller. Miller had been his superior. He died in 1990. Harlan said Miller told him. Rusk is protected. By whom? Harlan looked at the detective. People with money. That sentence explained decades of silence, but it did not prove who ordered Laura's murder. The investigators returned to the recording. They isolated the voices. They compared them with surviving recordings of Rusk. The match was confirmed. Then Crane, also confirmed. The tape was authentic. Laura was alive. Rusk was threatening her. Crane was present. That alone could have transformed the case. But there was another voice. A third man. The audio specialists enhanced it. The voice became clearer. The man said, "Where are the copies?" The detective recognized it. Thomas Keller, the attorney, the man whose letter said the situation had been contained. Keller had been inside the barn. He knew Laura was there. He knew the documents existed. He knew what happened afterward. But Keller was dead. Again, the trail led to a grave. The investigators began looking at Keller's surviving family. His son had inherited his office. He agreed to provide records. Among them was a Cosette labeled August 1978. Private. Investigators played it. Keller's voice appeared. He was speaking to someone. The other voice was distorted. But one sentence was clear. Crane says the girl has copies. Keller answered, "Then find them." The other man said, "What about the police?" Keller replied, "I'll handle the police." The recording ended. The detectives sat in silence. The case was no longer just a murder. It was an organized cover-up. But there was something else. The recording was dated August 17th, the day before Laura disappeared. The investigators compared it with Laura's diary. Her final entry had been, "I know who did." Then the next line, "If anything happens to me, ask about the blue truck." She knew. She knew someone was coming. She knew the truck mattered. And somehow, she still tried to leave evidence behind. The detectives now understood the significance of the blue truck. It was not merely the vehicle that carried Laura. It was the common link between Michael Grant's death and Laura's disappearance. It connected Rusk to both victims. It connected the garage to the barn to the creek to the body, and the financial records to the people who had profited. But investigators needed a living suspect. Then they found one. Ernest Cole, the truck driver. He had admitted seeing Laura, but he had withheld another detail. He had been the man who delivered the equipment to the barn that evening, and he had seen Rusk after Laura was killed. Cole agreed to testify. He said Rusk approached him near the truck. His hands were covered in blood. Rusk said, "You didn't see anything." Cole answered, "I didn't." Rusk leaned closer, then said, "Good." Cole said he was terrified. He left. He never spoke about it again, until the detectives came. The prosecution now had multiple independent witnesses: Price, Cole, Samuel Rusk, Gerald Mason, Evelyn Price. Their memories were decades old, but their statements overlapped in critical details: the blue truck, the barn, the creek, Laura, Rusk, Crane. The investigators knew the defense would attack every witness, so they built the case around the physical evidence: Laura's remains, the necklace, the fabric, the button, the blood inside the truck. the repair records, the financial transfers, the photographs, the diary, the tape, the ledger, the hidden documents. The evidence had survived because different people had unknowingly preserved different pieces. No single clue solved the case. Together, they formed the story. Then came the most unexpected discovery: a fingerprint. Not from the truck, not from the barn, from the metal box Price had hidden. Investigators found a partial print on the inside of the container. The print did not belong to Price. It did not belong to Laura. It did not belong to Rusk. It belonged to someone still alive, a man named Daniel Mercer. Mercer had worked for Crane in 1978. He had been 24. He was now 72. And investigators discovered something astonishing. Mercer had never been questioned. Not once. His name appeared in company payroll records. He had access to the barn. He had access to the trucks. He had access to the storage unit. And his fingerprint was now sitting on evidence connected to Laura's disappearance. Detectives went to his home. They did not know whether he was a witness, an accomplice, or something worse. When they showed him the photograph of Laura, he immediately began to cry. Then he said 6 words. "I thought everyone was dead." The detective asked, "Who?" Mercer looked toward the floor. Everyone who knew. Then he confessed that he had been at the barn that night. He had seen Laura. He had seen Rusk. He had seen Crane. And he had seen the man who gave the final order. Not Whitmore. Not Keller. Someone else. Someone who had never appeared in the original case. Mercer said the man arrived just before midnight. He walked into the barn. He looked at Laura. Then he looked at Rusk. And he said, "Finish it." Mercer told investigators the man's name. The room went silent, because the name belonged to someone still alive, someone who had spent 48 years believing the truth would never reach him. And the detectives finally understood why the forgotten clue had survived. The blue truck had never been the end of the trail. It had been the beginning. Mercer did not say the name immediately. He sat across from the detectives with both hands pressed against the table, staring at the photograph of Laura Bennett. His breathing had become shallow. For almost a minute, nobody spoke. Then he finally whispered the name, Harold Whitmore. The detectives already knew it. Whitmore had appeared in the financial records. His company had funded Walter Crane. His name had surfaced in the old investigation. But until Mercer spoke, there had been no living witness placing him inside the barn. Now there was. Mercer said Whitmore arrived shortly before midnight. He remembered the car, a black sedan. He remembered the expensive coat. He remembered Whitmore walking through the barn as if he owned the place. Because, in a way, he did. The stolen equipment operation had been built around Whitmore's money. Crane handled the companies. Rusk handled the machinery. Keller handled the legal problem. Others moved the equipment. But Whitmore controlled the money. And according to Mercer, Whitmore had come to the barn because Laura had discovered the one thing that could destroy all of them: the documents. Mercer said Laura had refused to tell them where the copies were. Crane had demanded answers. Rusk had threatened her. Keller had tried to convince her that cooperating would protect her. Laura did not believe him. Then Whitmore arrived. Mercer remembered Laura looking at him. She said, "You're the one behind it." Whitmore did not deny it. He simply asked, "Where are the copies?" Laura said nothing. Whitmore looked at Rusk. Then he said, "Finish it." That was the sentence Mercer had carried for 48 years. 2 words. Finish it. The detectives asked what happened next. Mercer looked toward the photograph. He said Laura fought. She screamed. She tried to escape. Rusk grabbed her. Crane blocked the door. Mercer said he backed away. He did not want to be involved, but he was already involved. He had worked for Crane. He had helped move stolen equipment. He had seen the records. He had known what the men were doing. And now he was standing inside the barn while a woman was being threatened because she had discovered their secret. Mercer said Whitmore left first. Keller followed. Crane stayed behind. Rusk stayed. Mercer said he remained for several minutes. Then he heard a violent struggle. He heard Laura scream. Then silence. When he returned, she was motionless. Rusk was standing beside her. Mercer said he did not see the exact moment she died, but he saw the aftermath. He saw blood. He saw the canvas sheet. He saw the men preparing to move her. The detectives asked why he had never spoken. Mercer answered, "Because I was scared they would kill me too." He had spent decades carrying the guilt, but fear had kept him silent. Then investigators asked about the metal box. Why was his fingerprint inside? Mercer explained. He had helped Price hide it. He had touched the box in 1978. He had not known what Price intended to do with it. Price had told him, "One day, somebody will need this." Mercer never asked who. He simply walked away. That box had survived. The evidence had survived. The people had not. But now, almost 50 years later, Mercer was alive, and his statement placed Whitmore at the center of the crime. There was only one problem. Harold Whitmore was also dead. He had died in 2014. No arrest was possible. No courtroom confession. No dramatic handcuffs. The case seemed destined to remain a historical reconstruction. Then detectives discovered that Whitmore had a son, Jonathan Whitmore. He was still alive, and he had inherited his father's estate. Investigators searched the family's properties. They found business records, photographs, tax documents, and a locked cabinet that had belonged to Harold. Inside were dozens of files. Most concerned legitimate business, but one folder was different. It had no label. Inside were handwritten notes, payment records, names, dates, and a photograph of Laura. The same photograph investigators had found in the barn, except this version had writing on the back, "Problem solved." The handwriting was identified as Harold Whitmore's. Investigators compared it with known business documents. The match was strong. The photograph had been kept by Whitmore. That meant he had preserved evidence connecting himself to Laura. But the most important document was a letter. It was dated August 21st, Sill, 1978, 3 days after Laura disappeared. The letter was addressed to Walter Crane. It said, "The Bennett matter is finished. Make sure the accounts are cleaned before September." The wording was chilling. The Bennett matter. Not Laura. Not the missing woman. The Bennett matter. As if a human life had become a business problem. Investigators found another document. A payment authorization. $15,000. Recipient. Calvin Rusk. Date. August 22nd, Sill, 1978. Description. Final service. The detectives now had a financial link between Whitmore and Rusk immediately after Laura's disappearance. The case had moved beyond theory, but prosecutors still had to confront the reality that the primary suspect was dead. The investigation could establish what happened. It could expose the cover-up. It could clear Laura's name, but it could not put Whitmore on trial. Then the detectives looked at the living people who remained. Daniel Mercer, Leonard Price, Samuel Rusk, and Jonathan Whitmore. The prosecutor believed Jonathan might know more than he admitted. He was called in for an interview. At first, he denied knowing anything. He said his father never discussed the old case. The detectives placed the photograph on the table. Jonathan stared at it. Then they placed the letter beside it. He recognized his father's handwriting. His expression changed. The detective asked, "Did your father ever mention Laura Bennett?" Jonathan remained silent. Then he said, "Yes." "When?" "When I was 16. "What did he say?" Jonathan looked down. "He said she caused problems." "Did he say what happened to her?" "No." The detective pushed the photograph forward. "Did he keep this?" Jonathan nodded. "Why?" "I don't know." The detective asked, "Did your father ever tell you to keep quiet?" Jonathan's answer came quickly. "Yes." "When?" "After I found the file." "What did he say?" Jonathan looked toward the door. "He said some things were better left buried." That statement was not enough. But Jonathan had something else, a memory. He remembered being in his father's office in 1989, 11 years after Laura disappeared. He had found a Cosette. His father had taken it away immediately. Jonathan remembered hearing a woman's voice. He believed it was Laura. The Cosette had disappeared afterward. Investigators asked where it was. Jonathan said he did not know. Then he remembered something. His father had a safe deposit box, a box that had never been transferred to the family. The bank still existed. The detectives obtained a warrant. Inside the box was a Cosette, one photograph, and a handwritten note. The note said, "If they ever reopen the Bennett case, destroy this." The detectives did not destroy it. They played it. At first, there was only static. Then Harold Whitmore's voice. Clear, calm, cold. He was speaking to someone. The other voice was Rusk. Whitmore said, "You made a mess." Rusk replied, "She wouldn't talk." Whitmore, "Did she tell you where the copies were?" Rusk, "No." A pause. Then Whitmore said, "Then find them." Rusk asked, "And the body?" Whitmore answered, "Take care of it." The recording ended. The detectives listened again. The words were unmistakable. Whitmore knew Laura was dead. He knew Rusk was responsible for moving the body, and he had ordered the destruction of evidence. Even though Whitmore was dead, the recording provided a devastating historical link, but prosecutors still wanted to know what happened to the missing copies Laura had hidden. If they found those documents, they might explain the entire operation. The detectives returned to the red folder. Diane had preserved it for decades. Most of the papers had already been examined, but one page contained a strange notation, a series of numbers. At first, investigators believed they were account numbers. They weren't. They were coordinates, old property coordinates. The location was outside Ashburn, a small wooded area near an abandoned quarry, the same quarry where Michael Grant's body had been found in January 1978. The detectives went there. They searched the ground. Nothing. Then they noticed an old concrete drainage pipe. Inside was a rusted metal container. The container was sealed. Inside were photographs, copies of financial records, and a letter from Laura. The letter was dated August 18, hours before she disappeared. It was addressed to Diane. Laura wrote that she had discovered the truth about Michael Grant. She said Grant had been killed because he found the stolen equipment records. She said she had followed the same trail. She named Rusk, Crane, Keller, Whitmore. Then came the final sentence. "If they come for me, the blue truck will tell you where to look." Diane had never seen the letter. It had been hidden. Laura had created a backup. The detectives finally understood. The blue truck was not just a vehicle. It was the thread connecting everything. Michael Grant, Laura Bennett, the barn, the creek, the stolen equipment, the payments, the cover-up, the murder, and the missing evidence. The investigators now had enough to reconstruct the entire sequence, but there was still one question. Why had the original investigation failed so completely? The answer was buried inside the police records. The detective who initially questioned Rusk had written a private memorandum. It was never included in the official case file. The memo stated that Rusk was the strongest suspect. It stated that Rusk's story had changed. It stated that witnesses had placed his truck near the creek, and it recommended a search warrant for the garage. The warrant was never issued. At the bottom of the memo was a handwritten note. Order from above. Do not pursue. The current investigators traced the handwriting. It belonged to Captain Miller, the same officer identified by Sergeant Harlan. Miller had ordered detectives to stop. Why? Because someone had paid him. The payment record was found in the old financial documents. $5,000. Date: August 25th, Sill, 1978. Recipient: a private account connected to Miller. The case had been compromised. The murder investigation had been deliberately weakened. Evidence had been ignored. Witnesses had been dismissed. And Laura's family had been left believing the police simply could not find the truth. But the truth had been there. It had been in the reports, in the photographs, in the ledgers, in the truck, in the barn, in the tapes, in the handwriting, and in one sentence written by a frightened young woman before she vanished. Ask about the blue truck. Now the investigators had everything except one final piece. They needed to know exactly how Laura died, and for that answer they returned to the medical evidence. Modern forensic specialists re-examined her remains. They found a microscopic fragment embedded in one of the old fractures, a tiny metallic particle. It had survived 48 years. The laboratory identified the material. It was not from a gun. It was not from a knife. It was from a specific type of mechanics tool, a heavy steel wrench, the same type used at Rusk's garage, the same type visible in photographs of the blue truck, the same type found inside the barn. The medical examiner concluded that Laura had suffered a fatal blunt force injury. The case now had a likely weapon: the victim, the location, the vehicle, the witnesses, the financial motive, the recordings, and the confession-like statements from those who had finally decided to speak. But there was still one living man whose name kept appearing in the evidence: Daniel Mercer. The detectives asked him one final question: who struck Laura? Mercer closed his eyes. Then he answered, Calvin. And who ordered him to do it? Mercer opened his eyes. Harold Whitmore. The detective asked, Are you certain? Mercer nodded. I heard him. And why? Mercer looked at Laura's photograph. Because she found out what they did to Michael. For the first time, the entire case had a motive that connected both victims. Michael Grant had discovered the operation. Laura discovered Michael's murder. The same men were involved. The same blue truck appeared. The same money moved. And the same silence followed. The cold case was no longer a mystery without direction. It had become a documented chain of crime. But one question remained. If the men responsible were dead, who would finally face the consequences? The answer came from the surviving member of the conspiracy, the man whose fingerprint had been found on the evidence box, the man who had been inside the barn, the man who had spent 48 years hiding what he knew, Daniel Mercer. And when detectives told him he could still be charged, he did something nobody expected. He asked for a lawyer. Then he said, I'll tell you everything. What he revealed next would transform the investigation, because Mercer did not merely admit that he had witnessed Laura's final hour. He admitted that he had helped carry the evidence away, and he knew exactly where one final piece had been hidden, a piece so important that investigators believed it could finally prove what happened inside the barn: the weapon, the wrench, and it had been sitting in a place nobody had searched since 1978. The wrench was not buried in the ground. It was not hidden beneath the barn. It was not inside the blue truck. It was sitting in a place so ordinary that investigators had walked past it for decades without realizing what they were looking at. Daniel Mercer finally told them where: an old machine shop on the edge of Ashborough. The building had changed owners several times. The sign had been replaced. The windows had been boarded. But the original concrete floor remained. Mercer said the wrench had been placed inside a steel cabinet shortly after Laura's death. Rusk had told him to clean it. Mercer never did. He simply hid it. He said he was afraid to destroy it. Maybe some part of him knew that one day someone would come looking. Investigators obtained a warrant. The cabinet was still there, old, rusting, locked. They opened it. Inside were dozens of tools. Most were ordinary, but one was wrapped in an oily cloth, a heavy steel wrench. Its handle was dark with age. The forensic team photographed it before touching it, then sealed it. The laboratory examination produced a result that stunned investigators. Traces of human blood remained in microscopic grooves. The DNA profile was degraded, but the profile was consistent with Laura Bennett. The tool had been sitting inside the cabinet for nearly 48 years. And now the object that investigators believed had caused Laura's fatal injuries had finally been recovered. But the wrench was not the only thing inside the cabinet. There was a folded receipt. August 19th, Sill, 1978, the day after Laura disappeared. The receipt showed a cleaning service. The item: industrial tool, emergency cleaning. The customer: Calvin Rusk. The investigators stared at the document. Rusk had attempted to clean the weapon. He had failed. And then he had hidden it. The evidence had survived because nobody had known where to look. But the case was still not over. Daniel Mercer had promised to tell everything. The investigators brought him back into the interview room. This time, he did not ask for another break. He started from the beginning. He said Michael Grant had discovered the theft operation in January 1978. He had found equipment numbers being altered. Machines would disappear from one company and reappear under another name. The money moved through shell companies. Crane controlled the operation. Whitmore financed it. Rusk handled the physical work. Keller protected them legally. Mercer was a small part of the operation. He delivered equipment. He changed labels. He moved paperwork. He never believed anyone would die. Then Michael Grant confronted them. Mercer said Grant threatened to expose everything. Crane panicked. Rusk was sent to frighten him. But the confrontation became violent. Grant was beaten. His body was taken to the quarry. The official story became an accident. The investigators had suspected foul play, but someone inside the department made sure the case went nowhere. Mercer admitted he knew. He stayed silent. Months later, Laura began asking questions. She noticed the same equipment number. She noticed Grant's name. She found payments connected to Crane. Then she found something even more dangerous. A copy of the payment made to Captain Miller. Laura understood that the police had been compromised. That was why she became afraid. She knew going directly to the police might not save her. So she began making copies. One for Diane. One for the locker. One hidden near the quarry. Then she called Rusk. She wanted answers. Rusk met her. He tried to convince her to stop. She refused. Mercer said Rusk reported everything to Crane. Crane contacted Keller. Keller contacted Whitmore. And the decision was made. Laura had to be stopped. On August 18th, Rusk picked her up. She believed he was taking her somewhere to talk. Instead, he drove her to the barn. Mercer said Laura realized what was happening almost immediately. She tried to escape. Rusk grabbed her. Crane tied her hands. Keller arrived later. Whitmore arrived after him. The men demanded the location of Laura's copy. She refused. She told them Diane had them. Whitmore became furious. Mercer said Whitmore asked Rusk, "Does she know where the third copy is?" Rusk said, "Yes." Whitmore looked at Laura. Then said, "Then she can't leave." Mercer said that was the moment he understood she was going to die. He tried to walk away, but Crane stopped him. He told Mercer, "You're already in this." Then the struggle began. Laura screamed. Rusk struck her. Once, then again. Mercer said he heard Laura fall. He did not see the final blow, but when he looked again, she was motionless. The barn went silent. Whitmore checked her pulse, then stood. He said, "Find the copies." That was it. No panic, no shouting, no fear, only instructions. Mercer said that moment haunted him for the rest of his life, because Laura had been alive minutes earlier, and now the men were discussing her death like a business problem. They wrapped her body, loaded her into the truck, then drove toward the creek. Mercer followed. He said Rusk dug the grave. Crane stayed near the truck. Whitmore did not go to the creek. He left. Before leaving, he told Rusk, "Make sure nobody finds her." The investigators asked Mercer why he had never told police. He said, "Because I knew what they could do." He had watched what happened to Grant. He knew what happened to Laura. He believed he would be next. So he remained silent. For 48 years. The detectives asked about the third copy. Mercer said he did not know where Laura had hidden it, but he knew where she had told him to look, the old quarry. Investigators had already searched it, but Mercer said they had searched the wrong side. He drew a map, a narrow access road, an abandoned drainage pipe, a tree that had been struck by lightning, the same location where the first box had been found, but there was another pipe nearby. The investigators returned. They searched. Nothing. Then one technician noticed fresh soil disturbance beneath a collapsed section. The area was excavated. A second metal container appeared. Inside were dozens of pages. Financial records, names, account numbers, photographs, and one cassette. The cassette contained a recording Laura had made herself. Her voice was calm, but underneath it was fear. She explained what she had discovered. She named Michael Grant. She named Rusk, Crane, Keller, Whitmore. And Captain Miller. Then she described the blue truck. She said she believed the truck had been used when Grant was killed. She believed it had been used again when she was taken. Then she said, "If you're hearing this, something happened to me." The recording paused. Laura took a breath, then continued, "I don't know who I can trust anymore." Her voice became quieter. "My sister knows where one copy is. Another is in the locker. The third is here." She described the quarry. Then she said, "If they find all three, they can destroy the truth." The recording ended. The detective sat in silence. Laura had anticipated her own disappearance. She had prepared evidence. She had tried to protect her family, and she had been right. The documents were devastating. The financial records proved the theft operation. They showed payments to Crane, payments to Rusk, payments to Keller, payments to Miller, and payments from Whitmore's companies. One record stood out. A payment dated January 1978. The same month, Michael Grant died. Recipient: Calvin Rusk. Amount: $8,000. Description: cleanup. Then another. February 1978. $5,000. Quarry. The investigators believed those payments were connected to Grant's murder. Laura had discovered the same pattern. That explained why she was killed. She knew the first murder had been covered up, and she knew the same people were responsible. The cold case had become something much larger. 2 murders, 1 operation, 1 group, and decades of silence. But the investigators now faced a legal challenge. Much of the evidence was old. Some witnesses were elderly. Several suspects were dead. Some records were incomplete. The prosecution needed a living defendant. That meant Daniel Mercer. Mercer had admitted his involvement. He had helped move the body. He had hidden evidence. He had remained silent. But he insisted he had never killed anyone. The prosecutors had to decide whether to charge him. The detectives believed Mercer was telling the truth about the murder, but they also believed he had committed serious crime. He had participated in the cover-up. He had obstructed justice. He had helped conceal evidence. And he had known about Laura's death for nearly 5 decades. The prosecutor offered him an agreement. If he testified fully and truthfully, the state would consider reduced charges. Mercer accepted. His statement became the centerpiece of the renewed investigation. But investigators were still missing one crucial detail: the identity of the person who had actually delivered the fatal blow. Mercer said it was Rusk. The physical evidence supported that theory. The wrench belonged to Rusk. The blood matched Laura. The truck belonged to Rusk. The witnesses placed him at the barn, but there was no living person who had seen the exact moment. The prosecution knew the defense would argue that Rusk acted alone, and because Rusk was dead, the real responsibility might never be tested in court. Then detectives examined Harold Whitmore's estate again. They found another letter. This one had never been cataloged. It was written in 1980, 2 years after Laura's death. The letter was addressed to Rusk. Whitmore wrote, "You handled the Bennett situation exactly as instructed. Keep the past buried." The investigators sent the document for forensic analysis. The handwriting was confirmed, but another detail mattered. The paper came from Whitmore's company. The same paper used for the letter found in the barn. The same blue paper connected to Laura's warning. The pattern was becoming almost impossible to dispute. Whitmore ordered. Rusk acted. Crane organized. Keller protected. Miller concealed. And Mercer remained silent. The entire system had worked because everyone played a role, but the system had one weakness: time. Time destroyed the people who built it, and time preserved the evidence they thought they had buried. The investigators now had enough to present the case publicly. The press conference was scheduled. News cameras gathered outside the courthouse. The chief of police stepped forward. He announced that the department had solved one of Kentucky's oldest homicide investigations. Laura Bennett's family watched from the front row. The chief said her death was no longer classified as unexplained. He named the primary suspect, Calvin Rusk. Then he named the surviving participant, Daniel Mercer. The room erupted with questions. Was Mercer being charged? Had Whitmore ordered the murder? Was Crane involved? Why had police failed in 1978? The chief answered carefully. He said the evidence showed a coordinated conspiracy. He said multiple people had participated. He said some had died before justice could reach them. But one person remained, Daniel Mercer, and the detectives had one more surprise. They had found evidence suggesting Mercer was not merely a witness. He had participated in the disposal of Laura's body. That meant the case could finally produce an arrest. Not for the man who swung the wrench. He was dead. Not for the man who ordered the murder. He was dead. But for the man who had helped hide what happened. Mercer was taken into custody. He did not resist. He looked at the cameras, then said, "I should have spoken 48 years ago." The word spread across the country. Kentucky, 1978. Cold case solved. Forgotten clue leads to arrest. The story that had vanished from the headlines was suddenly everywhere. But inside the courtroom, the family did not see a headline. They saw Laura. They saw a photograph of a young woman who had tried to expose corruption, a woman who had written warning, a woman who had trusted people who betrayed her, and a woman whose final act had been to hide the truth so someone else could find it. The prosecution prepared its case against Mercer, but there was still one final mystery. Why had Laura's body been moved from the barn to the creek? Mercer said he knew. He said Rusk had been afraid of one thing, the barn, because someone had seen them there, a witness, someone investigators had never identified, someone who had been nearby on the night Laura died, someone who might have seen the final moments. And when detectives finally located that witness, they discovered something astonishing. He had been carrying a camera, and he had taken a photograph that could reveal exactly what happened after Laura left the barn, a photograph that had been hidden for 48 years, a photograph that might finally prove who was standing beside the blue truck when the body was moved. The investigator placed the photograph on the table, turned it over, and saw a date, August 18th Sill, 1978. Then he saw the image, and the man standing beside the truck was not Rusk. It was someone else, someone whose name had never appeared in the original investigation.